Hello, and welcome to the first in my lecture series on alcohol. Alcohol is a fascinating drug, and I'll do at least one and maybe two other lectures after this one, but for the time being, let's just get started by observing that alcohol is a drug which has a kind of a mixed picture. It's a drug which is basically, or most generally, a depressant for the central nervous system. But it's a drug that's also associated with some stimulant effects. These effects tend to show up early on in the drinking episode or at lower levels of intoxication. But, most of us, at least most of us who drink alcohol, are familiar with the idea that if you have a drink or two, you may feel a little bit more impulsive, a little bit more gregarious or social, maybe more willing to take risks or have fun. Certainly if you continue to drink or merely just let time pass, you'll tend to experience some of the depressant effects of alcohol, where you feel a bit tired, maybe a bit dysphoric afterwards. So it's a drug which kind of has this mixed profile in terms of how it affects our overall mental state. Alcohol is a social drug. It's consumed mostly, or at least most often, with family and friends. It's woven into the fabric of our socializing. It often serves as a marker for important social occasions like graduations or weddings or even funerals. We sometimes describe alcohol as a social lubricant, at least in so much as it seems to make awkward socializing easier to do. If you're trying to meet new people or even approach a new potential romantic partner, it sometimes seems easier if you've had a drink or two. So alcohol is used in different settings for those purposes, at least seemingly. Alcohol is a drug which has some benefits associated with it. It's a drug which people use to relax or sometimes to cope with stress. If used in moderate amounts, it can have some health benefits in terms of decreasing risk for some forms of illness, particularly cardiovascular illness later on in life. However, alcohol has some huge risks associated with it. It's an addictive drug and people can become dependent on it. There are a variety of personal and societal problems related to alcohol, and alcohol, if used in a not moderate way, if used in a heavy fashion, can pose all sorts of health risks to the body. It's a rather toxic drug, despite the fact that it's a drug which is widely available and legal for most people, at least most adults, to use. So there's a lot of stuff we can talk about with regards to alcohol. I can't cover it all in this lecture, but just to get us started, I want to focus a little bit on how alcohol is made, where it comes from. I'll talk a little bit about the social history of alcohol, stretching from ancient Asia up through modern day or roughly modern times in America. I'll actually do a little bit of history in my next lecture as well, so as not to overload this lecture, but I want to touch on some of alcohol's long and very interesting history. I'll talk a little bit about current use of alcohol by asking, what is a drink of alcohol? How do we count the amount or measure the amount of alcohol that people are consuming? And I want to focus a little bit on things like binge drinking and heavy drinking, and even a kind of a relatively new phenomenon, caffeinated alcoholic beverages. That'll give us enough to talk about today, I think. Alright, so let's start with making alcohol. Well, when we talk about alcohol, we're not talking about the whole broad category of chemicals, which are alcohols. We're talking about ethyl alcohol, or ethanol. Ethanol is a product of fermentation, as you probably know. It occurs naturally in the world anytime simple sugars are in contact with a variety of different yeasts, which consume those sugars and produce as a byproduct ethanol. Ethanol has currently and has for a long stretch of humanity had a variety of different uses. It can be used as a disinfectant, it can be used as a fuel or fuel additive, and obviously for the purposes of this class it can be used as a recreational drug, and that's really what we're most interested in right now. As I mentioned, alcohol is the product of fermentation, a natural process where yeast convert sugars, which can be present in a solution of grains or fruit juices, and convert those sugars to ethanol and carbon dioxide. Now, this is the same phenomenon that we're taking advantage of if we're baking bread. I like to bake bread in my spare time, and the bubbles that sort of rise the loaf of bread come from fermentation as yeasts in your baking yeast interact with sugars and simple starches in the dough that you're making. And if you wanted to make something as simple as wine, all you would need to do is create a source of kind of sugars in water, whether it's mashed up fruit or fruit juice, or even mixtures of water and sugar or water and honey, and you would get, through natural fermentation, which would occur from yeasts present in the environment or from yeast that you added deliberately to the container, a simple wine beverage, which would have alcohol, some foam from the carbon dioxide, and have the residue of whatever it was that you were fermenting. If you wanted to get a little bit more sophisticated, you could do some brewing. This is the process which gives us beer. Here, what we're typically doing is we're malting barley or some other grain. We're allowing it to begin to germinate, so that as the if you take barley and you mix it with water, those little kernels of barley will start to sprout and grow, and as they do that, natural enzymes present in those kernels of barley will start to convert the starches in the barley into simple sugars the plant would otherwise be using to grow, but simple sugars which are more easily available to yeasts to be broken down in fermentation. If you wanted to do this, you could malt your barley, and then you could dry it out, then mix it with water and yeast, and you'd have beer. In fact, some of the oldest recorded kind of archaeological evidence for brewing, intersects with evidence for making bread. Some of the early, in ancient times, people would make bread, and they could make a dough that they could rise to actually, to bake into bread, or they could make a very sort of thin soup of mixed up grains and water and allow it to just kind of naturally brew into a thick, kind of muddy beer, which doesn't sound very good, but it probably was for them. Now, fermentation, when it occurs naturally, can produce a product, whether it's a wine or a beer, that has between 5 and 15% alcohol by volume or percentage of alcohol. And it really depends a lot on the type of yeast that you're using, how aggressive that yeast is, and the fermentation conditions that you have, how warm or how long you allow fermentation to go on. 15% alcohol is kind of on the high end that you can typically achieve through fermentation. At higher levels of alcohol, yeast will go inactive and eventually die. So that's kind of the upper end of how alcoholic you can make a beverage. That is, unless you use distillation. Distillation is the process by which you take a wine or a beer and you make it into a liquor. And again, you may probably know this already, or you've certainly heard the word distillation before. How it works is you take a mixture like a beer or a wine, something that's got, through natural fermentation, some alcohol in it and a lot of water, and then you boil that solution gently and take advantage of the fact that alcohol, or ethanol that is, I'm going to use those words interchangeably, boils at a lower temperature than water does. So a skilled distiller using a good distillation rig can slowly extract mixtures of water vapor and alcohol vapor that are successively stronger. First distillation, you might get a bump up in alcohol content up to maybe 20%. If you distill again, or if you use kind of a series of distillation equipment, you can eventually get concentrations of alcohol that are upwards of 40%, 50%, or even higher. So you're sort of successively boiling off the alcohol, but trying not to boil off that water to get a resulting liquid, a liquor, which is more alcoholic than you could otherwise achieve if you were only using just basic brewing techniques, basic fermentation techniques. This is a table from a textbook that I used to use, and it just gives, albeit in rather wordy fashion, some information on some common alcoholic beverages like beer and wine and spirits. And you can see here a little bit about how they're made, and you can also see, if you look on the right column, kind of the level of alcohol in terms of the percentage by volume of alcohol that you commonly find in those products, whether it's beer, 48% alcohol, wine, about 12%, whiskeys, 40 or 50%, and so on. Here's just the second part of that table. I cut it off into two parts so that you could take a look at it. Now, in this country, we often don't talk about percent alcohol by volume, or at least we sometimes do, but it's more commonly, at least for spirits or liquors, we use the term proof. And proof is just a way of measuring alcoholic concentration. Now, proof has a very interesting history. Back in the 18th century, when you were making whiskey or making some sort of other, or rum or some sort of other spirit, you wanted to sell it, you wanted to be able to prove to your buyers that you actually had made a liquor as strong as you were advertising. And the way you could do that was you could mix gunpowder in with a sample of your liquor and see if it would light on fire. And if your mixture of gunpowder and liquor had enough alcohol in it, the gunpowder would ignite and burn, and you would have proof of spirit. If you were trying to cheat your buyer and give them a watered down liquor that was not very alcoholic and was mostly just water, then mixing in the gunpowder would fail to ignite and you wouldn't have proof of spirit. Nowadays, of course, we don't do that. We don't light our beverages on fire, or at least we shouldn't. At least we shouldn't with gunpowder. What we do is just measure using basic chemistry the alcohol content of a beverage, and we double the alcohol content of the beverage and call it proof. So if you had a liquor like a vodka that was 40% alcohol by volume, you might slap a label on it saying that it was 80 proof. So again, vodka, depending on the brand you buy, might be 80 proof or 90 proof. Beer and wine are less often advertised with a proof, but we do often see on labels the level of alcohol content in them, and kind of a repeat from the earlier slide I showed you, but wines can vary between 10% alcohol for some of the lighter white wines, especially from Europe, to 14% alcohol for some of the darker reds, often from California. Beer can be all over the place, from 3% to 6% or even higher alcohol content. Okay, so that's a little bit about kind of roughly what alcohol is and where it comes from, but let's think a little bit about the history of alcohol. People sometimes say that alcohol is humanity's second most popular drug, and that's probably second only to caffeine. It has a history that's at least as long as caffeine's history. We don't know exactly where that history began, but there is archaeological evidence dating back to about 8000 BC in China, where pots and other vessels containing residues of what appear to be wine have been discovered. So we think that for many millennia ago, people were fermenting wine and perhaps brewing simple beers. There's evidence for the Middle East, including places like Egypt, of beer that was brewed maybe as long ago as 6,000 years BC. Again, the evidence suggests that in the Middle East and probably elsewhere, beer either was a byproduct of the attempt to make bread, or maybe even was a forerunner to the attempt to make bread, and just occurred when people would mix ground up grains, flours with water, allow them to naturally start bubbling, which would indicate to them that something special was happening, and then it could be consumed as kind of a thick, almost porridge that would have alcohol in it. So not the type of beer that we consume today, but not really all that different. In ancient Greece and ancient Rome, there was widespread cultivation of grapes for wine, and if you have ever taken a class in sort of ancient religions or even mythology, you may be familiar with some of the gods from the Greek and Roman pantheon, like Dionysus or Bacchus, who are associated with wine and also with ritual ecstasy. So way back in the day, if you were a devotee of Dionysus, you might go out to a ceremony and consume a great deal of wine and enter kind of a state of incredible intoxication and sort of religious ecstasy as you were, worshiping the god. Now, alcohol has a long history of religious kind of significance, not just in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Obviously, both Judaism and Christianity use wine as a part of the sacrament, or at least in Christianity it is. It also figures into various Jewish ceremonies as well. And it's actually interesting to note that religious significance attached to alcohol allowed alcohol to continue to be made, or maintain the kind of the knowledge of how to make alcohol throughout the Dark Ages and into the Middle Ages after the fall of the Roman Empire. Monasteries in Europe and in the Middle East were among the areas where knowledge about how to grow grapes and how to grow grains and then transform them through fermentation into wine or into beer was maintained, when a lot of other knowledge was lost, at least in what we might now call the Western world. distillation was discovered, or really frankly rediscovered, much later on in Europe, around the 12th century, we think, based on some medical texts that survived from that time. Now actually, those medical texts are copies of earlier Arabic texts that detailed plans for how to build a distilling apparatus and how to operate them. And in the Muslim world, because of prohibitions against alcohol use, as far as we know, most of the distillation that was done in previous centuries was done to produce alcohol, liquors which weren't given for recreational use but were used for medicinal purposes. And in sort of the Middle Ages in Europe, there was a period of time when alcohol was similarly used, or at least distilled alcohol was similarly used for medical purposes. Nowadays we have a word or a phrase aquavit, which you sometimes see on labels of spirits in wine stores, meaning water of life. Usually these are brandies or kind of cordials where brandies are mixed with other sort of herbs and sort of flavorings. Back in the day, these were thought of as being sort of life-giving spirits which could be given to people who were very sick. There's historical accounts of people using various alcoholic mixtures to treat all sorts of illnesses, including things like the bubonic plague. So there was a period of time in Europe when alcohol, or at least distilled alcohol, was seen principally as a medicinal product. But of course, over time, unsurprisingly, people began to use it more and more for its recreational effects or its recreational uses. I mentioned the idea of using alcohol medicinally. I'm going to briefly talk about gin, which is one of my favorite liquors to consume. Gin, as you may know, is just basically a beverage which is made when grain alcohol is flavored with extracts from juniper berries and other sorts of medicinal or botanical products, various herbs and spices and fruits, etc. Again, it was probably invented first somewhere around the 12th century, probably in Italy, probably based on previous Arabic medical texts. But over the following centuries, gin's popularity spread throughout Europe up till the 18th century, and indeed up through modern times. And as it spread, it was used more and more as a recreational beverage. And the technology around distilling gin, and frankly distilling any form of liquor, got better, with the result that gin became stronger and cheaper to use. So by the mid-1700s in London, for instance, there's a period of time known as the gin craze, where widespread social problems were ascribed to the use and abuse of gin. Some historians have compared this to the crack epidemic, that's crack cocaine epidemic in America in the mid-1980s. The comparison being that social problems like the collapse of families, crime, sort of urban poverty, etc., all seem to kind of intersect with the use of a particular drug. Back in the day, it was cheap, very alcoholic gin. In the 1980s, it was the idea that crack cocaine was this especially, or having this especially poisonous effect on inner cities around the United States. And actually, this picture here is a print made from a wood, or I don't know if it's a woodcut, but it's essentially a print made from an etching done by an artist named Horgoth. It's actually a two-part. You can see on the right here, Gin Alley. It's a bit of a blurry reproduction, but I'll try and find a good link to put online. And on the left, you can see Beer Lane. And if you look closely at the pictures, you can see that there's kind of an implied message about the relatively good or healthy way to use alcohol and the relatively bad or dangerous way to use alcohol. On the right, all the people in Gin Alley are suffering. There are mothers who are so drunk that they're dropping their babies. There's people wasting away from disease. There are buildings falling down and people fighting in the streets. On the left is Beer Lane, where people are sort of plump and happy and healthy. There's an artist painting a picture. There are men and women hugging. Everyone seems sort of healthy and happy. I like these two prints because I think we often, when we talk about drugs, make moral judgments about what type of drugs are good to use and what type of drugs are bad to use. And it's not that these judgments are always entirely moral or entirely divorced from any sort of basis in reality, but it's very easy to slip into thinking of a drug, in this case the same drug, alcohol, as being very bad if you use one form of it and very good if you use another form of it. And that kind of weird, almost let's say, I don't want to misuse the term, but almost kind of schizophrenic or sort of bipolar notion of a drug, of alcohol, is something that, at least in Europe and probably throughout the world, we've contended with through a lot of history. This sense of seeing one drug in two profoundly different ways. Anyway, if we move on, we can get to kind of the colonial period and later, if we think about like the 16th through 18th century in the Americas. Europeans bring alcohol to the Americas. There is technically some archaeological evidence suggesting that some native peoples in the Americas produced their own alcoholic beverages through fermentation, but Europeans certainly brought the technology to do distillation of alcohol to produce spirits like rum and whiskey to the Americas. Those were unknown, as far as we can tell, before the colonial period. So Europeans bring alcohol to the Americas, and alcohol becomes, like tobacco, a very valuable commodity for trade. You think back to a history class that you took in grade school, or maybe even junior high or high school, you may remember triangular trade. Triangular trade was a kind of a mercantile relationship that existed between the colonies in Europe and the colonies in Africa, wherein rum and other goods were sold to Africa, also to Europe as well. Slaves were imported from Africa to the Caribbean to farm sugar. A byproduct of sugar, when you produce it, is molasses. Molasses was then shipped to New England to be made into rum, which was then shipped back to Africa and also to Europe. So triangular, or maybe rectangular, depending on how you draw the lines, trade, which among its other consequences massively increased the demand for slave labor. So much as the value in terms of trade of tobacco led to this big demand for slavery, the value of rum and later on other alcohols as well, but especially rum, led to an increased demand for slave labor in the Americas as well. Another regrettable part of the history of alcohol in the Americas was the way alcohol was used in dealings with Native American peoples at the time. Again, there's some archaeological evidence to suggest that some Native American peoples had access to alcohol before the arrival of Europeans, access to non-distilled alcohol that was fermented naturally. But again, with the arrival of the Europeans and colonialization, and frankly the taking of huge amounts of land in the Americas, Native American peoples came into contact with distilled alcohol, and it had largely a negative effect on them. Alcohol was used by Europeans and Americans for negotiating treaties. It was offered in exchange for land. It was offered during negotiations to get the Native Americans drunk so they would agree to unfavorable terms in negotiation. It was sold to Native American populations because it was a lucrative or valuable commodity to sell. And often, or at least at several points in history, Native American leaders publicly complained about this trade, publicly complained about the cost that intoxication from alcohol was extracting on their peoples, and begged Americans and Europeans to stop selling as much rum and as much alcohol and as much whiskey as they were. But these protests were largely ignored because, again, there was a lot of money to be made doing it. And this leads me to kind of an important idea, and it's one that I've touched upon before, I think, and that is just simply that the drug trade tends to be incredibly profitable, whether we're talking about tobacco, or whether we're talking about alcohol, or indeed talking about other drugs that we can think of. It's incredibly profitable for some, but it often comes at a great cost to others, especially other groups who are relatively disadvantaged. People who are poor, or are minorities, or are members of other countries or other ethnic groups, often women. People who are less advantaged often bear a great cost in the drugs trade. And that's true nowadays if we think about the drugs trade and things like heroin or cocaine. It's true historically when we think about drugs trade in other things, even things as humble as tea and coffee. So drugs, or at least the drugs trade, can be negative, at least for some folks, but prohibiting drugs or regulating the drug trade is often very hard. So attempts to regulate the alcohol trade, or even to tax alcohol a lot, often led to unintended consequences like increases in crime and increases in smuggling. And that was true up in the 20th century during the era of Prohibition, which I'll talk about in my next lecture, and it was even true back in the colonial period as well. There's also an interesting idea here that I'd like to point out, and that is that the history of America is in part a history of the drugs trade, whether those drugs are tobacco or alcohol or even opium, something I'll touch on in a future lecture. And I don't bring this up to seem disrespectful or to seem too overly negative about America. I'm American. I like this country. I'm happy to live here and raise my family here. But I think if you love something, even your country, you have to be honest about it. And if we're really honest about the history of our country, there are some dark chapters in our history. And the dark chapters sometimes, not always, but sometimes have to do with drugs. And we need to keep that in mind, especially now when we think about our current drug laws and our current war on drugs. We have to remember where that all came from. Just as an example of that, I want to briefly talk about, again, about alcohol and Native Americans, and note the really unfortunate stereotype of the drunk Indian. The idea of Native American peoples, Indian peoples, as being unable to control their use of alcohol, and when they drink, when they drink alcohol, having the tendency to become savage or dangerous or kind of stupid and out of control. It's a really terrible stereotype, but you see it quite a lot. I mean, if you type in drunk Indian into a Google search engine, you come up with all sorts of really unfortunate and kind of offensive memorabilia like this alcohol flask here that you can see pictured on this slide. Now, it is true to say that there are elevated rates of some alcohol problems among Native American communities, and this has led some people to speculate that maybe Native Americans have a natural or even genetic risk for having alcohol problems as compared to other populations. There may be some truth to this, or at least for a while it was thought that there's some truth to this, because folks who trace their ancestry to Asia, especially the Pacific Rim of Asia, tend to have a gene for a different version of an enzyme which is used in the metabolism of alcohol. I'll touch on this in my next lecture. Folks who have this different version of the enzyme tend to have less efficient metabolism of alcohol and tend to process the drug more slowly, and can have a kind of a facial flushing reaction where they turn very red and may feel even kind of dizzy when they consume alcohol. So for a long time, and I remember this back in undergrad and even in grad school, there was speculation that because Native American peoples arrived from Asia across the land bridge from the sort of across the Bering Straits during the last ice age, that maybe they carried with them this genetic liability to have difficulty metabolizing alcohol, and perhaps as a consequence have greater problems controlling their use of alcohol. More recent research suggests that this just isn't the case. We don't see the type of genetic variants of the alcohol dehydrogenase enzyme, that's the enzyme, in Native American populations the way we do in populations from the Pacific Rim of Asia. So there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence for this sort of genetic risk to alcohol problems among Native American peoples as compared to, say, among white populations or Asian populations. Again, we do see greater levels of alcohol problems among some Native American populations in the United States, but these are probably due to social risk factors that those populations suffer from, like elevated rates of poverty, limited access to education and employment, and limited access to health care, especially mental health care. So again, are there problems among Native American populations with alcohol use? Yes, there are, unfortunately. These problems are similar to those we see among other groups, pardon me, who face similar sorts of risk factors. I guess if it's not obvious, the point I'm trying to make is that this stereotype, the stereotype of the drunk Indian, probably like all ethnic stereotypes, is just not accurate. It has more to do with historical prejudice against Native Americans than it has to do with any sort of empirical evidence about their decreased ability to use alcohol safely. So again, just to be clear, it's something worth learning about, it's something worth kind of informing yourself about. Anyway, elsewhere during the 16th to 18th century in America, among populations of Europeans and Americans, there was widespread use of alcohol. If we look at diaries and other historical accounts from that time period, we see that people drank a lot, maybe as many as 5 or more drinks per day. I actually don't have the book in front of me, but one of my favorite history books about alcohol has an excerpt from a diary of a young Benjamin Franklin who describes his sort of daily activities when he was apprenticed as a printer. And it involved getting up, having beer for breakfast, having a beer break in the middle of the morning, having beer for lunch, beer in the afternoon, beer in the evening, so on and so on. Alcohol was a major source of calories for people during that time, and given that a lot of what was being consumed, at least on the East Coast, was beer, it was not perhaps as dangerous as when people were consuming lots and lots of liquor. Despite this, there were concerns about the health problems and the social problems associated with alcohol use, especially use of distilled alcohol, the use of liquors like whiskeys and rum. Benjamin Rush, one of the lesser-known founding fathers of our nation, was a physician and a social reformer, and he's one of the people who wrote some of the first medical texts about the idea of alcohol or alcoholism as a disease. So you can see here a print from his pamphlet, The Effects of Ardent Spirits. By ardent spirits, he means distilled spirits like whiskey and rum, upon the human body and mind, with an account of the means of preventing and the remedies for curing them, by Benjamin Rush, MD, and Professor of Medicine. Rush is famous to us now for a number of reasons, including the fact that he was one of the first people to argue the idea of dependence or addiction as a disease, that is, the consequence of using a drug a lot, rather than a moral failing. I mean, back in the day, and even now, we sometimes look upon people who have drug problems or alcohol problems, and we imagine them as being sinful or morally imperfect. It's easy to kind of blame them for their problems. Rush and people since his time have argued that this isn't a very useful way of thinking about addiction. Rather, it's helpful to think about addiction as a disease, not unlike other diseases which we might choose to treat. And again, Rush advanced some of the first ideas about how you might treat people with drug problems, or at least with alcohol dependence. A little bit later in history, in the 19th century in America, we saw the rise of the Temperance movement. This is really a broad kind of coalition of different other social reform movements, religious movements, public health movements, women's rights movements, which kind of coalesced around the idea that people were using too much alcohol. They were simply drinking too much, and that this was creating all sorts of problems for individuals and for society as a whole. Temperance advocates argued for the reduction of alcohol and eventually even for the elimination or prohibition of alcohol. I'll talk about this a little bit in my next lecture when I sort of get back into the history in the 20th century and talk about prohibition. But for the time being, we'll leave the 19th century and the temperance movement by just taking a look here at a family temperance pledge. This is a pamphlet from roughly that time period where people who were interested in temperance would make a public pledge that they would either reduce or even abstain from using alcohol. Here we're saying, the undersigned solemnly promise by the help of God to abstain from the use of all intoxicating drinks as beverages. And if you make the pledge, you write your name there. So again, I'll talk about this history a little bit more in my next lecture, but for the time being, I'm going to take a pause and going to move from talking about the history of alcohol to talking about current use of alcohol. What do we know about how much alcohol people are using nowadays? Well, in order to answer that question, we actually have to think about how much drinking people are doing, how much of the various sorts of beverages people are consuming. As a bit of a preview, we'll say that the best estimate is people are drinking, on average, per capita, about 1 to 2 gallons of pure alcohol per year, which works out to about a half a fluid ounce per day, which, as we'll see in a slide or two, is about 1 drink per day on average in America. So not very much, and certainly not as much as people used to drink. This idea of a beverage or a standard alcoholic beverage is useful when we try to measure people's use of alcohol. We try and think of a standard beverage as being the volume of these different alcoholic drinks that gives you about a half or 0.6 fluid ounces of pure alcohol. So if we think about 12 ounces of regular beer, or about 8 or 9 ounces of a strong beer or a malt liquor, or about 5 ounces of wine, or about a shot or so of liquor, those all contain about half a fluid ounce of alcohol. Those are our standard drinks. So if we want to ask people how much alcohol they're consuming, we can give them that kind of equation and say, based on this kind of equivalence between these different sorts of beverages, how many drinks are you having per day? Another interesting way to think about this is if you picture in your mind, or if you have somewhere in your house now, one of these red Solo cups, which we see a lot at parties, they're actually a fairly good way of measuring standard drinks. If you fill liquor up to that very bottom line, that's about an ounce of liquor, so a little less maybe than would be a standard drink. Depending on the exact proof of the liquor. If you fill it up to the second line with wine, that's about 5 ounces of wine, so again, that's about a standard drink. And if you fill it up to the third line, not to the top, but to the third line with regular beer, that's about 12 ounces of beer, so that's your standard drink of beer. This is actually a good thing to keep in mind if you're ever out at a party or a social event where people are serving alcoholic beverages in Solo cups, because you can actually do a better job of counting how much you're drinking if you keep this in mind, and that can be really useful. Now, challenge is that although we have this idea of a standard drink, there are lots of alcoholic beverages out there that don't neatly fit that mold. So if you go to a bar, especially some of the newer bars which we have in Fargo, which serve craft beers, and you order a pint, which is usually 16 ounces of craft beer usually being stronger than regular beer, that can be maybe 2 drinks worth of alcohol. So 16 ounces of craft beer, assuming that it's about 7.5% alcohol by volume, a little bit on the high end, I suppose, that's 2 drinks worth of alcohol. Or if you go to a martini lounge and have a martini, it's likely that that's probably 1.5 or 2 drinks worth of liquor, not just, the simple 1.5 ounces of gin that you might expect. Similarly, if you order a scotch on the rocks or a whiskey on the rocks, you're probably getting about 2 drinks worth of whiskey. Or if you order a mixed drink like a Long Island iced tea or a margarita, you could be getting 3, 4, or even 5 drinks worth of alcohol. So the point is, it's easy to imagine a standard drink, but if you're really honest with yourself and you think about the type of beverages you order when you go out to a restaurant or a bar, you may honestly be drinking more alcohol than you think. It's also generally the case, and there's plenty of research to back this up, that when people are asked to serve themselves alcohol, when you give them an opportunity to pour themselves liquor or beer or wine, they tend to overserve themselves, giving themselves more than just the standard ounce or a standard measure of wine or standard measure of beer. Okay, so we have this idea of a standard drink. We acknowledge that it's not a perfect way of thinking about drinking because some beverages don't neatly conform to the standard, and many people either willfully or unknowingly overserve themselves. Still, basically, you can think of the average amount of alcohol consumed as being 1 drink per person per day. So however it's consumed, a beer, wine, or liquor, about 0.5 fluid ounces of alcohol per person per day. Well, it's actually not that simple, really, because there's a lot of variability in drinking. Now, clearly, some people don't drink at all, and some people drink very infrequently, and some people drink quite a lot. So it's not the case that every person in America, of course, is having their one precise standard drink per day. If we were, on average, we'd probably be a healthier group of people. What is more the case is that about 20% of the drinkers, that is 20% of people who consume any amount of alcohol, are actually consuming about 80% of all the alcohol. And if that's kind of hard to picture in your mind, think about it this way. Imagine that in the population of America, there were only 10 people. So there wasn't however many people are really in America, just 10. If we only had 10 people in America, 3 of those people would drink no alcohol at all. 5 of those people would drink 2 beers between all of them. They'd be sharing a relatively small amount of alcohol. And then the last 2 people would be drinking all the rest. One of them drinking 6 of the 10 beers. So again, 10 people, 10 beers, you get a sense of the variability in consumption. Most people drink little or not at all. Some people drink an awful lot. And we're concerned about those heavy drinking people because a lot of the negative consequences of alcohol show up for people who are heavy drinkers, whether that's increased risk for violence, increased risk for accidents, particularly things like drunk driving, or other problems. They're typically showing up in people who are drinking quite heavily. That's that relatively small fraction of the population that's drinking the most. You've almost certainly heard the term binge drinking. A binge has a fairly precise definition that's used when we conduct surveys of drinking behavior. It means drinking 5 or more drinks, or sometimes 4 or more drinks if you're a woman, 5 or more if you're a man, 4 or more if you're a woman, in one drinking session. And we often define a drinking session as being 2 hours worth of time, roughly. So if you're drinking 5 or more drinks, when you go out at night to the bars, or when you go out to a restaurant, or if you're sitting at home watching a Netflix movie and you drink 5 or more drinks, that's a binge. And as we'll discuss in the next lecture, that's enough to get most people quite drunk. You can see our man here, he's having a binge all at one go, consuming, looks like 5 glasses of Stella Artois beer all at once. So that's a binge. Again, we're concerned about people who binge because that's a pattern of heavy drinking. And it's not that you can't get into trouble drinking less amounts of alcohol. It is just the case that if you're drinking heavily, you're much more likely to have problems with alcohol of all sorts. So what do we know about the rates of alcohol use among people if we allow for this variability? Well, if we look at young folks and we look at the Monitoring the Future data, we see that there's a fairly decent amount of alcohol consumption even among adolescents. So if we look at people who are in 12th grade, high school seniors, they're underage, they're not supposed to be drinking, they can't legally buy alcohol, upwards of about 40% of them will report having used alcohol within the last month, what we sometimes might describe as current use of a drug. So not even have you ever had alcohol, but have you just had it within the last month. Maybe 40% of seniors will report that. And, a little bit less, maybe only 10% of 8th graders, but still 10% of 8th graders, that's a lot of relatively young people drinking. We also see in the Monitoring the Future data that there's a fairly high perceived availability of alcohol among young folks. Most people report that it's fairly easy or very easy for them to get alcohol, even though, again, it's an illegal drug for them. They cannot legally purchase alcohol. We look at Monitoring the Future and we look at rates of binge drinking. We see, not quite so high a rate of binge drinking, but we do see fairly concerning numbers. Upwards of 20% of people who are seniors will report having binged in the last 2 weeks. So just within the last 2 weeks, from the time when the person completes the survey, he or she is saying that he has had a binge or she has had a binge. That's a pretty disturbingly high percentage when we think about the fact that these are high school kids. And when we ask on the Monitoring the Future survey, to what extent do high school students see drinking, especially binge drinking, as risky or worthy of disapproval, there's moderate or maybe high perceived risk and disapproval of alcohol consumption, at least binge drinking consumption. So high school students are interesting to us. They use alcohol more than they use other drugs, but they have some level of disapproval or sort of perceived risk associated with this type of behavior. If we want to look at folks who are older than that, we can turn to the National Survey of Drug Use and Health. Here's some data from 2013. I know that's a couple years ago, but it's the most recent data that I could find online. And if we look at people who are over the age of 12, asking how many of them have used alcohol in the last month, about 50% of people or so will say that they've used alcohol in the last month, and about 25% or so will report that they've had a binge in the last month. That's fairly big numbers when you think about it. Half of all people are drinking fairly regularly, and maybe a quarter of all people are binging fairly regularly. That's kind of interesting, kind of worrying, I suppose. We sometimes use a term called heavy drinking. Heavy drinking, for our purposes, is just repeated binging. If you're drinking drinking enough to be characterized as having a binge on more than one occasion within a time frame, we typically call that heavy drinking. Maybe about 6% of the population in the National Survey of Drug Use and Health are reporting heavy drinking. They're more often men than women. They're more often young people, meaning sort of college aged and slightly older. And they're more often white people than other ethnic groups. So if we look at, again, National Survey of Drug Use and Health, you can see this very clever graph that they've set up where we look at different age ranges and we look at the level of just current use, that is, have you drunk at all in the last month? Binge drinking, have you had one binge within the last couple weeks? And heavy use, meaning have you had more than one binge in the last couple weeks? We see that that's the 18 to 25, or maybe especially 21 to 25-year-old range, where people are drinking the most. They're also doing the most heavy drinking and binge drinking. Typically older ages, we see lower levels of heavy drinking and binge drinking. And to be clear, it's that dark blue and that gray bar that we're really the most worried about. You could probably have some problems with alcohol if you're a light user of it, but you definitely can have problems with alcohol if you're a binge drinker or a heavy user of alcohol. Like I said before, we see the highest rates of alcohol use, including including just regular use, and some of the highest rates, not the highest rates, of binging among people who are Caucasian as compared to some of the other ethnic groups. Although alcohol is, its use of alcohol and even some of the problematic use of alcohol is fairly distributed across different racial or ethnic groups. So I mentioned a little bit earlier that a focus of measurement for alcohol use is college drinking. It has some obvious significance, I suppose, to the people who are watching this lecture, being college students themselves. College is associated with alcohol use currently and has been for many, many years. There are even old records of kind of old-timey drinking songs that people have been listening to for a long time, kind of highlighting the fact that drinking and college have gone together in this country for a long time, and frankly in other countries for literally centuries. There are historical accounts of the Middle Ages, people drinking beer at Oxford College and elsewhere. Anyway, in our country, more or less nowadays, 30-40%, more like 40% of college students will report binge drinking in the last 2 weeks. So that's a higher level of binge drinking than we see among the general population. I mean, roughly 20-25% of the general population will report binging in the last 2 weeks. Roughly 40% of the college population will report binging in the last 2 weeks. And again, the reason we care about that is we see elevated use or elevated incidence of alcohol-related problems, violence, sexual assault, accidents, etc., alcohol poisoning, etc., among people who are binge drinking. North Dakota State University participates in the CORE survey, or at least it has until relatively recently. The CORE survey, just as a reminder, is a survey that randomly samples college students and asks them questions about their use of alcohol and other drugs, and also some of the attitudes they hold towards alcohol and other drugs. And you can see a chart based on some data from the most recent results of the CORE survey here. And as you can see, North Dakota State University students are averaging around 5 or 6 drinks per week in the last year or so. That's a little bit higher than the national average, which is probably closer to 4, or the North Dakota schools average. So around here we're on average drinking slightly more than most other students in other universities. In that same data set, if we look at binging within the last 2 weeks, we can see that the percentage of students who report binging in the last 2 weeks at NDSU is around 52-53%. That's a little bit higher than the North Dakota average. It is a fair bit higher than the national average. So when I visit relatives elsewhere in the country and talk to them about living in North Dakota, and they ask me about things like drugs and alcohol, because I teach a class on it, they ask, do people drink a lot up here? And there is some truth to the stereotype of the North Dakotans as being, or people in the upper Midwest generally, as being kind of heavier drinkers than folks elsewhere in the country. This is an interesting graph I put up here, or table I guess I should say, that I put up. What it attempts to do is estimate the peak level of intoxication that people are achieving when they're drinking. And the way this is done is we ask on surveys for people to report their gender, we ask on surveys for people to report their height and weight, and then we ask, of course, how much they're drinking. And based on some simple calculations, you can kind of guesstimate how drunk people are getting on average when they're drinking. And what's notable here is when we look at North Dakota State University folks, both men and women, we're seeing that the estimated blood alcohol concentration is about 0.11. So as a reference, we'll talk about this more in the next lecture, 0.08 is the legal limit for driving, above which you're driving under the influence of alcohol. So 0.11 is quite a bit higher than that. When people drink at NDSU, they get pretty drunk on average. And you can see that that's true whether you're a man or a woman. You can see that's true whether you're overage or whether you're underage. And it is somewhat higher than the North Dakota average, or though maybe not so much so. That's on a different slide, but you can see here kind of a comparison across different years. So the important points to make here is that alcohol is a popular drug. You probably don't need a lecture or a class on that, to make that point. But alcohol is a popular drug. It's certainly more popular than a lot of the other drugs we're going to talk about in this class, especially among young people in the kind of 18 to 25 or 30-year-old range, especially among folks who are white or Caucasian, and especially among college students, And it's also worth noting that those folks, young people, especially young college students, are most likely to use alcohol in a dangerous way. That is, they're the group where we see the highest level of binge drinking and heavy drinking. Not that other folks don't do those behaviors, but we see them at elevated rates among folks probably like you, college people in your sort of early to mid-20s. And again, as I've said a few times, we're concerned about that because that's where we see most of the problems associated with alcohol use, some of which I'll talk about in my next lecture. Before finishing up, I want to briefly touch upon alcoholic energy drinks or caffeinated alcohol drinks. They're something that's been in and out of the news a little bit in the last 5 to 10 years. I've seen news stories about them. You may have noticed in stores brands of caffeinated alcoholic beverages like Four Loko. It's probably the most famous one that's sold in large cans. You can see here Four Loko advertised as having 12% alcohol by volume, so rather alcoholic. Up until recently, these types of beverages also contained a fair bit of caffeine. So like a caffeinated sports drink that you might consume like Red Bull, these drinks would have both alcohol and caffeine combined. So, like I said, Four Loko, just to pick on that brand because it's the most popular probably, they tend to be sold in fairly large volumes, so like a almost 24-ounce can, like a tall can. And depending on what state you're in, the concentration of alcohol in Four Loko and similar brands would range between 6% and 12%. So if you do the math, that works out to about 1.5 to upwards of 3 fluid ounces of alcohol per can that you're consuming. And take that amount and compare it back to our notion of a standard beverage as being anything that gives you about 0.5 fluid ounces of alcohol. Just do the math. It works out to the idea that a can of Four Loko or similar type of beverage would give you anywhere between 3 and 6 drinks worth of alcohol just in that can. So just consuming a can of Four Loko, depending on where you purchase it, because it does vary by state, would be enough to qualify for you for a binge. Or as some people I've seen on the internet have talked about it, it's a blackout in a can. We'll actually talk about alcohol blackouts in the next lecture, although I know I have talked about them before. Point is, these beverages, apart from the caffeine involved in them, just tend to have a lot of alcohol. And some of the news accounts of folks getting into trouble from drinking Four Loko and similar brands of caffeinated alcoholic beverages probably have to do with just simply the fact that they're consuming a lot of alcohol. It's going to be tough for you if you drink 3 to 6 drinks worth of alcohol in one can, because it's very unlikely you're going to make that can last for 4 or 5 hours. You're probably going to drink it in 10 minutes or 20 minutes, and that's a short amount of time to put a lot of alcohol in your body. Now, of course, I mentioned these are caffeinated beverages. They're not the only caffeinated beverages. Some, I guess, kind of trendy bars used to serve, maybe they still do serve, mixtures like Red Bull and vodka. Same idea, you're combining alcohol with caffeine. And that's an interesting combination because caffeine, as we know, is a stimulant. And one of the things that it should do is counteract some of the depressant effects of alcohol. As we'll see in the next lecture, when people drink alcohol, especially over time in a drinking session, they tend to start to feel tired. And this tiring out effect can be helpful in so much as it'll help to limit the amount of alcohol people drink. If you drink and you start to feel tired, you might just go home, or at least slow down how quickly you're drinking. If you drink something that contains a stimulant like caffeine, you'll feel more awake. More awake means you may spend more time out at the bar. More time out at the bar means you may drink a lot more. And there is some evidence to suggest that people who consume caffeinated alcoholic beverages do tend to get more drunk. They just drink more alcohol, perhaps because the caffeine is keeping them up and giving them energy to keep drinking, and get more intoxicated as a result. There's also some research to suggest that people who drink these type of beverages are more likely to get drunk, and that makes sense, of course, and maybe also more likely to do dangerous things while drunk, like get behind the wheel and drive. Now, these are non-experimental studies that just are based on looking at correlations between people's self-reported use of caffeinated alcoholic beverages and their self-reported inclination to drive or to engage in other dangerous behavior. But the general picture that this research presents is that, yeah, either because of just the straight up alcohol or because of the extra boost that the caffeine gives you, people who drink these type of beverages are more likely than folks who don't to get pretty drunk and maybe to do some dangerous things when they are drunk. So, an interesting bit of recent research, and actually used to include a slide about this in the lecture, but I don't now. In recent years, I think it was 2010, under pressure from the Food and Drug Administration, Four Loko, that one brand of caffeinated alcoholic beverages, reformulated their product, removing the caffeine from it. So you can still buy Four Loko at the store, at least I'm pretty sure I saw it the last time I went to the wine store, but it no longer contains caffeine. It still does contain an enormous amount of alcohol, so probably be careful when you're drinking a lot of it, or drinking a lot of any alcoholic beverage. Just a bit of advice. Okay, well that's enough for now. Here's a preview for next time. We're going to talk a little bit about the pharmacology of alcohol, how it's absorbed and how it's broken down and eliminated from the body. We're going to talk a little bit about the acute effects of alcohol in the central and peripheral nervous system. I'm looking forward to it. I think it'll be an interesting lecture. I hope you're looking forward to it as well. But in the meantime, if you can, take a little break, step back from the tablet, step back from the computer, and relax. Enjoy your time. I'm going to try to do the same. Take at least a little bit of a break here. And then when you're ready, come back for the next lecture. I'll see you then. And as I always say, thank you so much for your attention.